Welcome, everyone. My name is Harry Coulter-Pinner. I am the Interim Executive Director at IPPR, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to Liverpool and the first Labour conference in 15 years with Labour in government. Yeah, indeed, round of applause. Obviously, we are officially impartial, but you can clap. The question of us now is, what does Labour do with power? And they've set out a range of measures that they are pressing ahead with in the first 100 days, but they've also been clear that they need and want to deliver a decade of national renewal. And transformative governments do more than just a series of policy interventions. They engage deeply with how the world is changing, what citizens want and need, and they set out a governing philosophy and a set of policies capable of transforming society. And I think today's speakers are very carefully chosen because those governing philosophies rarely come from just one country alone. They are a partnership between progressive parties across the Atlantic and across the world. And it's why I'm delighted to welcome our speakers here today. So we have David Lammy, the Foreign and Commonwealth Secretary. We have Heather Boucher from the Council of Economic Advisors, from President Biden's Council of Economic Advisors. And we have our very own Dr. Parth Patel, who will intro some of the work that we're doing on what a decade of national renewal could and should look like. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to David to say a bit about what a decade of national renewal might look like, where those ideas are coming from, and what Labour needs to respond to in this moment. David, over to you.
Great, thank you very much. And the reason I'm on this platform is it was a long haul to get here. And particularly after the defeat in 2019, we had to do a hell of a lot, effectively in 4 years, to get to a point where we could make an offer to the British people that they could digest and accept. And IPPR and supporters were sort of instrumental, really, in accelerating that policy development, for which I'm very, very grateful. But it is also to say, I guess, that there's more work to do in office. And, you know, I remember even after years of opposition back under Thatcher and Major, we did start to struggle a bit in the sort of 2001 through 2002 period. You know, what's this really about? And so the business of ongoing development is really important. I think the centre of the subject today is, what does it mean to be a consequential government as opposed to just being in government? And when I think of short governments that have a project, the Attlee government after the Second World War weren't in power for very long, but were central to the building of the welfare state, particularly the National Health Service, and massive renewal in a period in which Britain effectively lay in rubble. And actually, on the foreign policy platform, which I'm very focused on, joining NATO, the development of the nuclear deterrent, huge transformative positioning at that time, and obviously the central alliance with the United States, particularly the special relationship being forged out of that Second World War experience. I then think, of course, of Wilson gripping the white heat of technology, a sense of Macmillan running into the sand with a very old Britain that was looking backwards, and Wilson gripping that sense of modernity and taking us forward. Still struggling with, particularly with a unionised Britain, and ending up in that Callaghan period with the winter of discontent, but nevertheless gripping a sense of the future. And then, of course, I think of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown's project. I think of concepts like the Third Way. I think of the big way in which Labour at that time, or New Labour at that time, gripped a partnership with the private sector and business, which many sort of forget. Of course, you can define it as a sort of neoliberal project, but it was the project of the times, and it positioned not just the Labour Party, but alongside Clinton's approach in the United States, Keating's approach at that time in Australia, Schroeder's approach running the SPD in Germany, a view that certainly set up the project for the 90s and into the noughties. I don't think that any of us could have possibly anticipated at the beginning of the coalition period, as worried as we were about George Osborne and David Cameron's austerity project, I don't think any of us could have anticipated where the country would be at this point in time. It would have been impossible for Margaret Thatcher to leave our public services in the mess that they are in, particularly services like our police force, the NHS on its knees, school buildings falling down, our transport system, a real sense that Britain is way behind the curve. So clearly we come in at a point where what we are inheriting is a huge challenge, because we have had a period where ideology and dogma and dog whistle politics and sharp rhetoric has governed policy making, as opposed to sort of empirical evidence and a seriousness in terms of, you know, a centre-right politics, if that's the perspective from which you're coming. So there are two things I think that are important for this debate. My foreign policy vision, which I set out before the election, I described as progressive realism. Progressive in ends, of course, because we are a progressive government after a period where you've got a government that has rowed back on the international rule of law, said that they would tear up treaties, a government that's been hostile to our closest allies in Europe, a government that is tearing up our general view on diversity and equality, a government that's torn up climate targets. So clearly progressive, because just by virtue, frankly, of coming to office, we're progressive, because that lot was so far off to the right. But, and this is the big but, and it's the bit that I emphasize, realist, meeting the world and finding the world as it is, not as we would wish it to be. Understanding a hugely different, challenging geopolitical context in which we have to forge partnerships with countries and allies who do not share our values, in which we are contending with a great competition between two great superpowers. We're in a much more multipolar world in which big actors, countries like Turkey, like the Emiratis, Saudi Arabia, India, are big players in Brazil, in their region. You know, when I think back to 1997 and the government that I was part of, it is phenomenal that at that point Britain had a bigger economy than India and China combined. Look where we are today. So this is a very, very different period, and therefore the realism of Ernie Bevin as Britain looked, as he looked out into the world, charged by Attlee after the Second World War, has very much spoken to me at the seriousness of the times that we are in. But as we set out those 5 missions, even though they are domestic, it has been very important to me to convey to the Foreign Office that the growth mission particularly can only be delivered internationally by our diplomats, particularly working with colleagues in the Department for Business and Trades, and therefore my speech last week at Kew was very important to centre the foreign policy around climate and growth. But the project, as it were, the project that I think is really important to hold on to, we learn as we look around the world at progressive governments. And the government, and this I hope leads into well into the next contribution, the government that I think we look to is this very significant, consequential Biden 5 years. Because if you think about the Inflation Reduction Act, if you think about the way that the United States has reorientated itself around the climate emergency, the green jobs that are necessary, the renewables that are necessary to transform our economy, the competition clearly also with China, I think that is indicative of the fundamental project of our times. And so when we think about what domestically Ed Miliband has to do over this period, you think about that ambitious 2030 target, you think about the decision to say that yes, there will be a transition, but no more licenses for oil in the North Sea. You think about the race to renewables, onshore wind, hydrogen, the huge work that now is going to go on in the British economy, the industrial policy that Jonathan Reynolds is centering, supported, of course, by the Treasury and Rachel Reeves, the securonomics approach that Rachel is taking, that underpins our approach to the country, both domestically and then internationally. There you have the central project. So in 10 years' time, we do have that transformed economy. We do have those jobs. The debate about climate is settled, at least domestically. And you see also, when you speak to Republicans, they're actually not going to unpick significant parts of the Inflation Reduction Act. The debate is settled, the economy is transformed, we're geared up and moving forward securely for the 21st century. That is the challenge, that is the opportunity. Centred on it is economic growth. If we don't succeed, there will not be the growth that we need in our economy. There will not be the funds for the public services that we want to see. And then also, I think, alongside that, and there'll be more to come, there has to be more to come, of course, the AI transformation and revolution that will also underpin that sense of the future that we have to own. And Peter Kyle is busy getting on and attending to that. That journey, of course, did begin under Rishi Sunak, but will be very, very important to get that acceleration.
There are so many things we could pick up on there. I just want to follow up on one particular point, David, which is if you look at the last project, the third way, I think globalization and openness to globalization, kind of very, some would describe, Danny Roderick would describe it as kind of hyper-globalization, very aggressive globalization, was absolutely at the center of that. Maybe slightly less central, but still important was the independent, creation of an independent DFID, state aid to countries. How are you seeing those two dimensions, thinking about foreign policy, in this new consensus that's emerging? How are those two functions, the kind of trade and migration element of globalization and also development, how do they change in this new world?
Well, that era was just so fundamentally different to where we are today. I did a speech at Tufts University very early as Shadow Foreign Secretary, where I picked up a phrase that was first coined, I think, by Kofi Annan to sort of conjure up the zeitgeist in foreign policy terms of the time. And the phrase that he used was problem without passports. So if we think about migration, we think about climate, we think about the change that those things are driving, the truth is concepts of development have also changed. If you're sitting in the Foreign Office today, you have to take on board China's Belt and Road. There are parts of the global majority countries where the truth is China built the airport, built the railway station, built the road that people can point to. They are less clear, frankly, where Western money went. Now, that may be a failure to communicate, but that is a reality. And then, of course, the climate finance issues mean that that's really that's got to be centered in any discussion of development. And certainly if you're sitting in a small island nation in the Caribbean or the Pacific, I think of more than half of the Commonwealth countries, for example, for them, this existential crisis that is climate requires big reform of climate finance, which is not just the classic old-style development questions. So there's a big debate about development. Development and diplomacy, it seems to me, go hand in hand, and you've got to have the right capabilities for it, which is why I've got a review that's underway to think harder about those issues. And it's why, by the way, the strains that we're seeing in the rules-based order, the challenges, I think, that we get from countries in the global south or global majority countries particularly have to be listened to at this time. And the tone with which you engage globally requires genuine partnership and not a sort of patronizing old-style way of looking at the world. It's a privilege for our country to be part of the UN Security Council. We take the view that there should be further reform, and there are other countries that should be part of the UN Security Council. We're the sixth richest economy in the world. We're outside soft power because of the British language and global brands like the Premier League and the BBC and others. So we use that to our advantage, of course, but we do it in a way that meets the times today. I've got to tell you, I do think that 1997, there are some examples to draw from. Winning, I think, is the central one, but clearly the times are very different.
Thank you, David. Heather, I'm going to come to you next. We're absolutely delighted that you've chosen to come and join us here in the UK for this conference. I think David's absolutely right in saying that Biden and President Biden and his agenda has moved forward the debate on what the new progressive consensus would look like. It kind of felt stuck post-crash for quite a long time there. We couldn't really get, the old was dead, but we couldn't get the new to emerge. Can you tell us a bit about what you've done and what you've learned from that, and what you would encourage David and others from the Labour Party to take forward from that?
Happy to. And as David was talking, I was thinking a lot about a speech that Jake Sullivan gave. I think it was in April, but it was in the spring at the Brookings Institution that laid out the connection between the domestic agenda and the foreign policy agenda. And I think that, you have to think about the economic policy domestically within that context. So I'll come back to that at the end of my remarks, but it's just I've been thinking about that a lot as you've been talking, and how important that the new economic playbook we are doing domestically is also a new global economic playbook, and rethinking what for so long was called the Washington Consensus. So those go hand in hand. So I want to make just 3 main points and then come back to this international point. I wanted to start by, and it's actually just a short quote from President Biden gave a big economic speech last week at the Economic Club in Washington, D.C. And he talked about how upon coming into office, we, quote unquote, faced a fundamental choice between the old playbook that in America we call trickle-down economics, and it basically means don't tax capital or rich people, and don't regulate them, let capital, let firms do whatever they want, and then the economy will grow, and then those benefits will redound. And he talked a lot about how that has been the playbook for 40 years, over 40 years at this point. And when he came into office with Vice President Harris and a new economic team, he made a very different choice. And we've been calling that middle out, growing the economy from the middle out and bottom up, and really turning that old narrative, that old way of thinking about the economy on its head. And in doing so, there were a number of, a variety of reasons to do so, but one, and we talked about this a lot on the campaign, was the need to meet the moment. It's the middle of the pandemic. The president is running a campaign from his house in Delaware. We're all on Zoom. And we have this huge pandemic with a unique kind of economic circumstances, right? Everything shut down. We have this massive supply side crunch. What does this mean? How do we think about it? It's different. And so we wanted to think about the scale and scope of a set of policies that would meet that moment, but also knowing that we were sitting in a country that at that point seen almost a half century of rising inequality across all axes, the catastrophic consequences of climate change that are just sort of barreling toward us, the need to build out a clean energy economy, and that in order to move forward, we could not get trapped in failed ideas or in models, an analysis that was grounded in a world that no longer existed. So really this openness to saying, this did not work, we need to take a new path. And middle out, I think, is such the appropriate phrase for President Biden and Vice President Harris, because it centers in our economic policy the goal that we want to achieve, which is a broader living standard for everybody, by thinking about how do we deliver economic growth. So not just sort of magically saying we're going to give everybody a pony, but that we have a theory of growth that is going to deliver that improved living standard. So it starts from there. And how can we make sure to take advantage of every opportunity in front of us and really know that we live in an economy that is, it's a private sector, it's a capitalist economy. We need the private sector. And so I think there's a lot of balancing between the old way of thinking that sort of said capital can do whatever it wants, and what the president and vice president put in place, which said, hey, we need to make sure that the goals are clear and that we're doing this in a way that benefits Americans. And as we're engaging in the international, we are focused on meeting our own domestic needs and letting other countries join us in their endeavors to meet their domestic needs while also achieving our international goals. So our economic agenda is based on three pillars. So let me lay out the 3 pillars, and then I'm going to give 3 measures of success, both of which I could spend hours on, but I'm really going to keep it pithy, but happy to answer questions or talk to anyone afterwards. So the 3 pillars is that, first and foremost, we are always focused on making sure that workers and their families and their communities benefit from economic growth, that we're putting workers first, we're empowering and educating workers. Second, we are thinking about how we shape markets to be fair and competitive, both domestically and internationally. Really important, and we can come back to that because I think that gets confused sometimes in the trade conversations, what we're trying to do. It's about fair competition. Then third, I have a second title, which is that I'm a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, but for a year and a half, I've been the chief economist for his Invest in America cabinet. And we are investing all across America in every community. And that is where we think about the implementation and the why of our 4 historic pieces of legislation: the American Rescue Plan that got us over the pandemic, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, which was also bipartisan, and the Inflation Reduction Act. That one and the American Rescue Plan were Democrats only. But one of our tactics, or the president's tactic, was to make sure we could do as much as we could in a bipartisan way to build that consensus. So that's the agenda: empower and educate workers, fair competition, investing in America. And we have seen this remarkable economic progress, which I think gives a lot of credibility to this pivot, that this idea that we are working from a new economic playbook. Really, there were good theoretical reasons to do it, but let me go over some of the highlights for why I think it's a great idea on the empirics at this point. So first, the United States had a remarkable economic recovery. Under the president's watch, we've created nearly 16 million jobs, and really importantly, the forecasts in the early years were that it would take 4 years. Congressional Budget Office, nonpartisan sort of scorekeeper in American politics, said it would take 4 years to get the unemployment rate down below 4%. We did that in the first year, and we kept it there for 30 months. In 2023, Bloomberg famously, to my mind, said 100% probability that we'll have a recession by the end of the year. We entered the year with growth over 3%, no recession. right? We have seen that we have outperformed time and time again. We've created jobs. We've had wages that have grown faster for workers at the bottom than workers at the top. So that's the first thing. Second, we have seen historic investments in the construction of new manufacturing facilities all across the United States. That is what the Investing in America agenda sought to crowd in. We have crowded in private capital, the things that matter, to semiconductors, to clean energy industries, the 37 industries that we are investing in. The scale of that is remarkable. We've had 6 record-breaking quarters. 3 of those quarters, as a share of GDP, the investment in new manufacturing, the construction of new manufacturing facilities, it's a bit of a mouthful, but that share as a percent of gross domestic product for 3 quarters was higher than we've ever recorded going back to 1956. So probably higher than at any point since the build-up to World War II. And then 3 quarters where it was just the highest going back to the 70s or 80s. But so this remarkable 6 quarters. And the third point is that investment that we've been seeing has been happening all across the United States. Disproportionately the announced investments are disproportionately being announced in places where income is below the national median and where people are less likely to have college degrees. So we've achieved the goal of trying to grow equitably. We've had a strong recovery, and we are making true this idea that we're going to invest in these new critical sectors. So this pivot that the president did to this new playbook was so important to reshaping our domestic investment, how we're thinking about the goals of our domestic economy, rethinking the rules at home, and that has been mirrored. And again, I'm thinking about this, and I should have noted, Jake Sullivan is the National Security Director for President Biden. So he is, sort of the president's architect for how we're thinking about the national security issues, working, of course, with the team of, foreign policy and U.S. Trade Representative and the like. But that speech that really laid out this new vision and built the case that as we're doing this domestically, we are mirroring this in how we're thinking about the international agenda and how we want to create pathways to promote equitable growth, both domestically and abroad. And really importantly, something I've been focused on a lot is making sure that we are giving countries the capacity to also invest in clean energy, which is such a global need right now, and seeing how different countries can fit in that clean energy supply chain. So I'll stop there.
Fantastic. We'll come back, I think, to some of those themes in Q&A. Parth, I'm going to hand over to you to talk a bit about and try and stitch some of that together into some of the work we're doing to kind of come up with the new progressive consensus. If you keep it below 5 minutes, we can then get some Q&A.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks very much. So for decades, social democratic parties, centre-left parties, were moving rightwards on economic issues, right? They were seeking out and winning affluent graduates. It was an incredibly efficient electoral strategy. That was broadly the third way turn of these parties, sort of led by the Democrats and by the Labour Party and Blair and Clinton, and also by the Germans. Now, in recent years, something kind of striking has happened. These parties seem to be U-turning. They are all moving leftwards on economic issues, despite winning an ever-rising share of voters from affluent graduates, from suburban affluent graduates in particular. So that's quite interesting, right? The Biden administration, that's sort of first term just now, has sort of pursued the most ambitious and redistributive economic agenda in at least half a century in America. And in the UK government, it's just started, it's just a few months in, but already you're seeing it's not comparable in magnitude, but certainly in direction, right? You've seen conversations around public ownership of critical infrastructure, public investment, the National Wealth Fund, a real emphasis on workers' rights and pushing back quite hard on corporate lobbying to water that down. You've seen the Prime Minister talk about people with the broader shoulders going to have to contribute more, which is, I think, a run-up to what we might see in a month's time. So you're seeing this U-turn here as well, just like we've seen in America, and you're seeing it in some European countries too. So I think there are 3 questions there. Why? Why are centre-left parties doing this? 2, how are they managing to do that, given they're increasingly dependent on pretty well-off graduates? 3, will it stick? will it become the thing that comes after the third way? I'll very briefly sort of say something on the first two and then just focus on the last one, given the timing constraints we're on. So, I mean, why are they doing this? I think the Foreign Secretary basically nailed this in terms of what he was saying. The world has changed dramatically in just a few years, and really dramatically since the last time Labour were in government, right? And necessity is the mother of invention. The policies and institutions designed to build economic growth, social justice, social stability in that old world, they don't really work in this new world, and we can all see that. The planet's on fire and inhospitable to our children, inhospitable to people today, in fact, right? That demands the largest planned transformation in our economy. There's new forms of geopolitical competition and instability. Wars are waging around the world, but also great power rivalry is back, which means actually we probably don't want the price of keeping the lights on here, or the price of the bread in those sandwiches at the back, or even the price of this thing to be reliant on people we're not sure we can trust. Necessity is the mother of invention. That's why this is happening. So how are they doing this, given that sort of that political sort of electoral coalition that they're holding? If I knew the answer to that, I'd be a political scientist, so I don't know the answer to that. The jury's very much out. There's some really interesting work happening in America on this, from Jacob Hacker, Paul Pearson, and that's clearly sort of inspired some of the thinking here. There's a few things to consider. One is sort of the approach is, at least the American approach, has not been sort of let's go for the top half of the income distribution. It's really focused at the layer on the top, the sort of the top tenth or even thinner than that. And again, I think you could see that being pursued quite similarly in the UK government's context, private schools, for example. That's the top tenth, it's not the top third. They're picking who they're going after in this kind of new economic agenda. I talked about affluent graduates. They are affluent, but they can also be progressive. Right? A lot of these people actually have cleaners that come to their houses, they order Deliveroo, they get into an Uber driver. They see people who could benefit from stronger workers' rights, and that affects them. So actually we should question, maybe they actually believe this. And then within a two-party system, at least in the UK and the US, lots of voters don't vote for the party that they're voting for. They often vote against the party who they don't want. Right? And that's quite a big factor here, actually. It gives you space to pursue things that you think are actually important, because where are the voters going to go? The third thing I said, will it stick? Will this new thing, is this going to form a new consensus? Can it? That's what I spend most of my time at IPBR thinking about. Is this a blip, or is this a structural moment for centre-left parties, for centre-left governments, for social democrats? The thing after the third way, are we in it? Now, people in the Biden administration, they quite openly talk about, let's defend the post-neoliberal project. We wouldn't dare say that here, right? We're far too English. And we talk about, well, let's build a decade of national renewal, which is kind of a different way of talking about the same thing, I think. And so if we are really going to build a decade of national renewal, three things will matter: ideas, policy, and politics, and they will have to sing together. On ideas, we're about to publish a report on this next week with the brilliant Phil Tinline, who's sadly not here today, but he essentially argues that if you are going to forge a new consensus, you can't just attack your opponents or your predecessors. You have to attack the ideas that underpin them, the ideas that underpin their policy decisions. And that's what really matters. And some of that's already happening. I think Heather spoke about this, right? It wasn't so long ago people thought markets allocate efficiency. No one really thinks that anymore. You listen to a single Rachel Reeves speech or a single Heather Boucher speech, no one really thinks markets allocate efficiently. Wasn't so long ago we thought borders are just going to dissolve and economic integration is going to keep going. No one thinks that anymore. Wasn't so long ago we thought the internet was good for democracy. No one thinks that anymore. And so some of that stuff is happening, and again in the US they're slightly ahead of this and sort of picking ideas and sort of discarding them and going after new ones. I think the jury is out whether the new Labour government will do that. If they want to build a decade of national renewal, they certainly will have to. They will have to expand the sort of the Osborneite strategy of pinning blame on Tories to pinning the ideas that underpinned the Tories. On policy, I won't speak too long on this because Heather was really, really clear on this, right? How they've operationalized those new ideas into policies in the USA, broad industrial policy, a focus on competition, on supply chain resilience, a much more active state in the economy. They were all pointing the same direction on their compass of ideas. That's the really important thing, right? You layer things on top of each other, you get compound interest, it starts to entrench. And the best example of that is Margaret Thatcher and her approach to trade union reform over 10 years. Now, the final thing I'll conclude on this is that politics really matters. Inherent in the concept of a decade of national renewal is that you're going to have to win more than one election. And forging a coalition isn't the same as sustaining one. The Democrats' experience of this is kind of a living, breathing, real-world experience of this. There's a really tight 50-50 election. And that's because voters today, they're less deferential than they once were. This is sometimes conveyed as a negative thing by progressives who say they're volatile. That's wrong. It's actually quite a good thing they're less deferential. That's a more demanding version of democracy. And it is why progressives are now starting to think beyond deliveralism. You know, they're sort of saying we can't just work hard to deliver our promises to voters. We need to go out and take credit for that. That's interpreted in large part, I think, as a branding thing, as a let's brag about these things, let's campaign about that. I think that's okay. I think it's a bit thin. Me and Harry have just come back from Montreal, where that was really the topic of sort of social democrats everywhere. But there's a slightly missing piece there. It's not as simple as a branding exercise. It's a representation exercise. Your job as a politician is not just to use the institutions of the state to deliver the promises you made for voters. It's also to sort of try and understand the interests and preferences of different groups of voters and represent that. Show that you're on their side in the way that the right-wing populist politicians are actually really efficient at. And so the anecdote I will leave you with is we're clearly in some kind of industrial revolution or the next thing that's as close to that. The last time there was an industrial revolution, the state got into every cultural space it possibly could. There were images of workers everywhere. Now, I'm not arguing that we should get back into that kind of propaganda, but that the state engaged in cultural spaces. If the new industrial policy of centre-left parties is going to stick, the state will have to engage in those cultural spaces.
Thank you. We're going to take one round of questions. Is there a microphone somewhere? Yes, so Mark is here.
Hi, I'm Mark Leonard from the European Council on Foreign Relations. A couple of quick questions for Heather. I just spent 3 months in Washington and was very struck by this sort of disconnect of the extraordinary success of Bidenomics and of what's happened in practice and the total failure of landing it in the consciousness of many Americans who, on all of the big subjects, think that Trump was better on the economy or migration, etc. What lessons do you think people in Britain can learn from that? And secondly, how do you do Bidenomics without a reserve currency?
Oh, well, second one is step one. Do you want to take a bunch?
Yeah, I'm going to take a couple more. The lady in the middle just here.
Thank you very much for a really great panel discussion. I'm Lisa from Save the Children. I was just curious about any specifics on how we can ensure that domestic economic policy doesn't result in forms of policy or protectionism at home that then hamper the prospects for renewal overseas. And so I was interested in more of the kind of specifics about the interesting points you were making about those connections between domestic economic policy and international policy. And then secondly, if I may, how important do you see the UK ODA budget in this? It was really great to read in the news this week about the recognition of the dangers of the UK's development budget falling, the amount of it that's reaching the global south actually falling to all-time dangerous lows. So I just wondered if you could say anything about that and how important kind of that side of the equation is. Thank you.
I'm going to take one more question, gentleman on the far left here, and then we're going to have to do rapid responses so that David can leave on time. Yeah.
Hi, I'm a commentator. My question is, I'm really grateful for progressive realism. It explains what we should do internationally. I hate the idea of progressive realism applied to domestic policy. Shouldn't we have something like assertive optimism?
Great. So, David, I might come to you on protectionism, ODA budget, those two questions. If you want to pick up anything else, do, and then we'll come to Heather on some of the questions about the Bidenomics agenda.
I think that the ODA budget is a sort of indicative of one of the challenges that we have. because in the end, if 3.7 billion is being spent on housing refugees across the country, then you've got a major challenge. And it's going to take some time to unravel that. You know that we are committed to doing that and getting serious about the challenges we face, particularly from organised gangs, and working in partnership with European partners, i.e. our foreign policy approach as well, is key to unpicking a key domestic agenda that then hopefully gives us more funds to actually work upstream in countries that might help in terms of preventing some of that migration. I think there's a dichotomy at the heart of your first question, and that dichotomy, of course, is that we are having this conversation at a time when I think quite a lot of working people want a degree of protection. They want a degree of a government on their side and a welfare state that supports them. And now, look, it's the central job of Rachel Reeves and Johnny Reynolds particularly to unpick that and present that, and Rachel will have her first opportunity in the budget that approaches. What I've tried to set out is that I think that internationally, a key component of that race to growth is, one, being realist about the partners that we have to work with internationally to achieve that growth. The Gulf would be a very important part of that. And by the way, on aid, we do need to work with new regional powers who say, please, can we work with you? You've got the expertise on development. We're giving more funds. How can we combine, for example, in the continent of Africa, to deliver genuine partnership? And of course, as I've said, I think that our approach on climate and the new economy and those new jobs, akin to what we've seen in the United States, is going to be a fundamental part of that national renewal.
Heather, there's a political dividend, are you
Yes.
getting the gains from it? And there's how does the UK deliver with that reserve currency?
So I will take those, but let me just briefly also talk on the protectionism, because I think it's so absolutely imperative, and riff a little bit on what David said. So in the U.S. context, and we certainly put a lot of ideas on the table a couple of years ago when we put in place the Inflation Reduction Act. I want to be very specific that we have thought about our industrial strategy in a set number of sectors that we think are strategically important for the United States, for our friends and allies, and for the world, right? So the really important technology that's in everything we use that right now is being dominated by a small number of countries, or really one country, like in semiconductors, that's something that we really need to build up our capacity on. That seems really important. Clean energy, we are moving to a new world. Right? Energy is in everything. It's in how we build our buildings, transport. Everything that we use was produced using energy, right? It's everywhere. And we are on the cusp of a new way of thinking about what does it mean for economic and national security for everywhere all over the world as we move into this new system. And what we know from the experts is that this decade, the 20s, is the decade to make progress on climate change. And the only way to do that is for us all to move to clean energy. And the only way to do that is to spend trillions of dollars, right? Somewhere between 3 and 6 trillion a year in deploying and developing and deploying these new clean energy technologies. Our Inflation Reduction Act was scored, and we can talk about the differences between scoring and reality, but it was scored at $370 billion over 10 years. Okay, so a little drop in the bucket relative to the need. Now it's crowding in over $910 billion of private capital has been announced being crowded in domestically. But so my answer to your question is, this is a moment where there is an enormous win-win, right? It may have been in other moments in history, we couldn't think that way, but there is an enormous opportunity. But the crux of that is giving countries the capacity and the space to develop their own manufacturing capacity for clean energy technologies. And how do we think about that as our goal right now? So there's a lot of room to bring countries in, and that's what all of my colleagues who work on the international side are working on, different kinds of agreements and arrangements to do that kind of, and thinking about this as an economic development strategy, both domestically and abroad. So I think it starts in that new twist. I'm going to take the confidence question because it is so important. On that, I just want to say a couple of things. It is true that we've done this big thing, and I think some people thought, well, magically, obviously, you sign the law, so obviously all the things will be built, all the jobs will be created, and everybody will be happy. That's not the way it works, right? First of all, when you are making investments for the long haul, it takes time. This program was for a decade, not for 1 year. This wasn't stimulus. This wasn't a quick hit. This is long-term investment in new things, and in new things that because we're solving global challenges. So the United States is an energy independent country. And so the idea that we are making these investments in new technologies, we are simultaneously thinking about the communities that are currently embedded in fossil fuels and thinking about the communities we are building in clean energy. That is one set of issues and challenges that make this not sort of, maybe not as, it's going to take time to show up in communities. The second, and I talked about it in my remarks, because we're doing something new, the economic forecasting community at the beginning has said, oh, you're not going to be able to succeed. And even as we did success, they said, yeah, it won't be sustainable, or there's going to be a lot of problems. And that has really affected the economic narrative, and I think has made, there's been a lot of doubt that has been sown by this, particularly from people that are Democrats in the media. So I think that has affected it. And the third thing I want to note, and this, take this for what you will as you all make your decisions, but as we got this historic legislation across the finish line, it required a debate within the Democratic Party on what would make it in and what wouldn't. The president's Build Back Better agenda included investments in global supply chains, in manufacturing, in clean energy, and investments in care, in child care, and in home care for the aging and the disabled. It included investments in housing. He made promises around student debt. And those things that have been long-standing economic pain points for Americans continue to be, but didn't make it across the finish line. And this is the agenda that the president and the vice president have continued to push for. But I think as we're thinking about how Americans experienced this Invest in America agenda, is they saw this big new factory going up, but the manufacturing jobs haven't shown up yet because it's just construction. They know that they're going to have to do some changes with this clean energy thing, and that's all new and exciting maybe, but challenging. But their kitchen table issues got harder because of inflation, and we did help them a little bit with the American Rescue Plan with childcare and other things. But I think people are like, wait, but are you going to be able to fix student debt? Are you going to be able to deal with these bread and butter kitchen table issues? And that is the business that we've continued to put in our budget, so we continue to work on.
Thank you. I'd love to be able to continue this conversation, but we are running over. So thank you everyone for joining us. This is the first of many conversations about what a decade of national renewal means, and we hope you'll join us on that journey. Thank you to our speakers, and thank you to all of you for coming.